The October morning air carried the crisp promise of winter as Sarah Elena Martinez stood before her classroom, watching the last of her students file out into the golden autumn sunshine. 3 weeks had passed since her return to Cedar Creek, 3 weeks of careful observation, quiet investigation, and methodical gathering of evidence that painted an increasingly clear picture of the injustice that had been perpetrated against her family. Now, as she organized her teaching materials and prepared to lock the schoolhouse for another day, she felt the weight of decision settling over her shoulders like her father's old wool coat. The leather portfolio on her desk contained more than lesson plans and student assessments. Hidden beneath the innocent surface of educational documents lay the fruits of her investigation. Carefully copied bank records that Tom Bradley had helped her obtain through his friendship with a clerk, detailed notes from her conversations with community members who had witnessed her father's decline, Professor Morrison's geological survey results that revealed the true value of the Double Bar Ranch, and most damning of all, a letter she had discovered in her father's old papers that proved Margaret had known about the mineral deposits months before their marriage. Sarah lifted the portfolio and held it for a moment, understanding that what she carried represented not just evidence of wrongdoing, but the key to restoring her family's legacy and ensuring that her father's life work would not remain in the hands of someone who had gained it through deception and manipulation. The responsibility felt enormous, but so did the quiet strength that had been building within her over the past weeks, fed by the support of friends and neighbors who remembered James Martinez with love and respected his daughter's determination to seek justice. The walk from the schoolhouse to the main street of Cedar Creek had become a familiar routine, but today it felt different, charged with the electric anticipation that comes before decisive action. Sarah nodded to the various townspeople she encountered, noting the subtle signs that her investigation had not gone entirely unnoticed. There were knowing looks from allies like George Henderson and Martha Kellerman, cautious glances from those who preferred to avoid taking sides in family disputes, and the occasional cold stare from individuals who had business relationships with Margaret and viewed Sarah's presence as a potential threat to profitable arrangements. At the law office of J.T. Whitman, Sarah paused before the modest wooden building that housed Cedar Creek's only resident attorney. She had been planning this meeting for days, waiting until she had gathered sufficient evidence to present a compelling case while carefully avoiding any actions that might alert Margaret to the true nature of her activities. Now, with her portfolio full of documentation and her resolve strengthened by the support of her community allies, she felt ready to take the first formal step in what she knew would be a complex and potentially dangerous legal battle. Whitman himself proved to be a man of perhaps 40, with the kind of sharp, intelligent features that suggested both legal acuity and personal integrity. His office was small but well organized, lined with law books and legal documents that spoke of serious professional practice rather than the opportunistic frontier lawyering that sometimes masqueraded as legitimate legal services in remote territorial communities. "Miss Martinez," Whitman said, rising from behind his desk to greet her with a firm handshake. "I've been expecting you, though I wasn't certain when you might decide to seek legal counsel. Please, have a seat and tell me how I can assist you." The directness of his approach impressed Sarah, suggesting that her reputation and circumstances were already known to him through the informal communication networks that connected all the professional men in small frontier towns. This was encouraging, as it meant she would not need to waste time explaining basic facts about her situation or convincing him that her concerns had legitimate foundation. "Mr. Whitman, I have reason to believe that my father's will and the legal arrangements surrounding his second marriage were executed under circumstances that call into question their validity," Sarah said, placing her portfolio on his desk and opening it to reveal the carefully organized documentation she had compiled. "I'm hoping you can help me understand my legal options and the best way to proceed." Whitman's expression became immediately more serious and focused as he began examining the papers Sarah had brought. He read through each document with the methodical attention of someone accustomed to evaluating complex legal situations, occasionally asking questions about sources and dates that demonstrated both his professional competence and his understanding of the challenges involved in challenging established property arrangements. "This is quite impressive investigative work," Whitman said after reviewing the entire collection of evidence. "You've documented a pattern of behavior and circumstances that raises serious questions about the validity of the legal arrangements that transferred your father's property. However, I need to be completely honest with you about the challenges you'll face in pursuing this matter through the territorial court system. Sarah had expected this warning, having learned enough about frontier law during her years of teaching to understand that property disputes involving deceased parties and complex family relationships were never simple or straightforward. What are the primary obstacles? First, the burden of proof will be entirely on you to demonstrate that your father lacked the mental capacity to make informed decisions during the period when the will was changed and the property was transferred. That's always difficult to prove after the fact, especially when the other party has legal documents that appear to be properly executed. Whitman paused to consult some notes he had made while reviewing her evidence, then continued with the careful precision of someone who wanted to ensure complete understanding of the legal realities involved. Second, Mrs. Margaret Martinez has been in possession of the property for 3 years now, during which time she has made substantial improvements and established what appears to be a successful ranching operation. Territorial law tends to favor established possession, especially when the current owner can demonstrate good stewardship and proper management of the property. But surely the evidence of fraud and manipulation has to count for something, Sarah protested, feeling a surge of frustration at the suggestion that legal technicalities might triumph over obvious moral wrongdoing. It absolutely does count, Whitman assured her, and the evidence you've gathered is stronger than what most people are able to produce in similar cases. The geological survey information is particularly compelling, as it provides clear financial motivation for the alleged deception. The testimony from community members about your father's mental decline is also valuable, though it would be stronger if we had medical documentation to support their observations. Sarah felt a flicker of hope at his assessment, but she could tell from his manner that there were additional complications he had not yet addressed. However, Whitman continued, confirming her intuition, you need to understand that mounting a legal challenge of this magnitude will require substantial financial resources. Court fees, expert witnesses, depositions, and the various other expenses associated with complex litigation could easily amount to several $1,000s, money that would need to be paid regardless of the ultimate outcome of the case. The mention of specific dollar amounts hit Sarah like cold water, forcing her to confront the practical reality that had been lurking beneath her determination to seek justice. Several $1,000s represented more money than she was likely to earn in years of teaching, far beyond anything she could hope to raise through her own efforts or reasonable borrowing against future income. Is there any way to pursue this matter without such substantial upfront costs? She asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. There are some alternatives, Whitman replied thoughtfully, but each comes with its own risks and limitations. We could attempt to negotiate a settlement directly with Mrs. Martinez and her legal representatives, though that would require her to acknowledge some validity to your claims, which seems unlikely given her apparent confidence in her legal position. He paused to make additional notes, clearly thinking through the various strategic options available to them. We could also consider a more gradual approach, beginning with formal requests for documentation and financial records that might reveal additional evidence of impropriety. If we could demonstrate clear fraud in the original transactions, it might be possible to interest the territorial prosecutor in pursuing criminal charges, which would reduce your financial burden while potentially achieving the same practical result. Sarah felt her excitement building at this suggestion, recognizing that a criminal prosecution would shift the burden of investigation and proof from her personal resources to the territorial government's law enforcement apparatus. What would be required to interest the prosecutor in the case? Clear evidence of criminal fraud, probably involving falsified documents or deliberate misrepresentation of material facts during the legal proceedings that transferred the property. The information about the mineral deposits could be crucial here, especially if we can prove that Mrs. Martinez knew about them before the marriage and deliberately concealed that knowledge from your father or his representatives. Whitman pulled out a clean sheet of paper and began sketching what appeared to be a timeline of events, marking key dates and decisions that would need to be documented and verified. The challenge will be obtaining access to the original legal documents and financial records that would contain the evidence we need. Mrs. Martinez and her attorneys will certainly resist any attempts to force disclosure, and without a formal court order, they have no obligation to cooperate with our investigation. But surely there are copies of important documents in various official offices, Sarah suggested, remembering the careful record-keeping practices she had observed at the bank and other business establishments. Absolutely, and that's where we'll begin. The Territorial Land Office will have records of all property transfers, the probate court will have copies of wills and estate proceedings, and the various banks and businesses involved in the transactions will have their own documentation. The key will be identifying exactly which records we need and finding legitimate ways to access them. Sarah found herself thinking about Professor Morrison's casual revelation regarding the geological survey results, wondering how many other pieces of crucial information might be hiding in plain sight, available to anyone who knew where to look and what questions to ask. Professor Morrison mentioned that he had shared his geological findings with Mrs. Martinez and with the bank president, Sarah said. If there were earlier geological studies that identified mineral potential on the property, wouldn't those be matters of public record? Whitman's expression brightened at this suggestion, and Sarah could see that he was beginning to appreciate the strategic possibilities inherent in her methodical approach to gathering evidence. That's an excellent point, and it represents exactly the kind of investigation that we can pursue without alerting the other side to our intentions. Geological surveys, railroad development studies, territorial planning documents, mining claims research, all of that information should be available through various government offices, and much of it predates Mrs. Martinez's arrival in the area. He made additional notes on his timeline, marking potential sources of information and key documents that would need to be located and examined. I think we have the foundation for a solid investigative strategy, Whitman concluded, setting down his pen and looking directly at Sarah with an expression that combined professional confidence with personal respect. It will require patience, careful documentation, and probably several trips to Denver and other territorial offices, but I believe we have a reasonable chance of uncovering evidence that could support either a civil lawsuit or a criminal prosecution. Sarah felt a surge of gratitude toward this man who was willing to take her case seriously and invest his professional expertise in pursuing justice for her family. What would you require in terms of legal fees for this kind of investigation? For the preliminary investigation and document research, I would charge you my standard hourly rate of $5, with the understanding that we would reassess the financial arrangements if and when we move toward formal legal action. I estimate that the initial phase of work might require 20 to 30 hours of my time, plus expenses for travel and document copying. The proposed fee structure was more reasonable than Sarah had dared hope, representing perhaps 2 months of her teaching salary, but still within the range of what she might be able to afford through careful budgeting and possibly some assistance from supportive community members. I think we should proceed, Sarah said, extending her hand to formalize their professional relationship. When could you begin the investigation? I can start immediately with the local records, and I should be able to make a trip to Denver within the next 2 weeks to examine the territorial archives. In the meantime, I would suggest that you continue your own careful observation and documentation, but without taking any actions that might alert Mrs. Martinez to the formal nature of your investigation. As Sarah left the lawyer's office and walked back through the center of town, she felt a mixture of excitement and apprehension about the path she had just committed herself to pursuing. The legal investigation would be expensive and time-consuming, with no guarantee of success, but it represented her best hope for uncovering the truth about her father's final months and potentially recovering the legacy that had been stolen from her family. The afternoon teaching session proceeded normally, with her students continuing to demonstrate the kind of eager engagement with their lessons that made her work genuinely rewarding. Sarah found that focusing on their educational needs provided a welcome respite from the intensity of her legal planning, reminding her that she was building something positive and valuable even as she worked to reclaim what had been lost. After dismissing the children for the day, Sarah remained at her desk to plan lessons for the remainder of the week, but her thoughts kept returning to the conversation with Whitman and the investigative strategy they had outlined. The prospect of traveling to Denver to examine territorial records was both exciting and intimidating, representing a level of formal legal action that would make her challenge to Margaret's ownership much more serious and visible. A soft knock at the schoolhouse door interrupted her planning, and Sarah looked up to see Elizabeth Crenshaw entering with a kind of purposeful manner that suggested important news or urgent business. "Sarah, I'm glad I caught you before you left," Elizabeth said, approaching the teacher's desk with obvious concern. I wanted to warn you that word is spreading about your visit to the lawyer's office this afternoon. Margaret has friends and business associates throughout the community, and I'm afraid your activities are no longer as secret as you might have hoped." Sarah felt her stomach tighten at this news, realizing that she had perhaps been naive about her ability to conduct a thorough investigation without attracting attention from the woman who had the most to lose from her efforts. "How serious do you think the situation might become?" Sarah asked, though she suspected that Elizabeth's warning indicated more than simple gossip or idle curiosity about her legal consultation. "I think you should be prepared for Margaret to take more direct action to protect her interests," Elizabeth replied grimly. "She's not the kind of woman who waits passively for threats to develop into serious challenges. If she knows you're working with a lawyer and gathering evidence, she'll almost certainly take steps to protect herself and her position." The implication of Elizabeth's warning was clear. Sarah's investigation had entered a new and potentially more dangerous phase, one in which Margaret would be actively working to counter her efforts rather than simply ignoring them as the complaints of a disgruntled stepdaughter. "What kind of steps do you think she might take?" "She could try to undermine your position in the community, perhaps by questioning your competence as a teacher or suggesting that your personal grievances are affecting your professional responsibilities. She might also attempt to gather her own allies among the business community, particularly those who have benefited from her successful management of the ranch operation." Elizabeth paused, clearly weighing whether to share additional concerns that might be even more troubling. There's also the possibility that she might try to accelerate her own plans for the property, particularly if she knows about the geological survey results and the potential for mineral development. If she can establish mining operations or negotiate sale agreements before your legal challenge gains momentum, it could make your position much more difficult. Sarah felt a chill of understanding as she contemplated the implications of this possibility. If Margaret began extracting valuable minerals from the property or sold development rights to outside investors, the legal and practical challenges of restoring the ranch to Martinez family ownership would become exponentially more complex. "Then we need to move more quickly than I had originally planned," Sarah said, her voice carrying the quiet determination that had sustained her through 3 weeks of careful investigation. "Mr. Whitman suggested that we could begin with local records before traveling to Denver. Perhaps we should start that process immediately, rather than waiting for a more convenient time." Elizabeth nodded approvingly at this response, clearly pleased that Sarah understood the urgency of the situation and was prepared to adapt her strategy accordingly. "I think that's wise. I also think you should consider expanding your circle of allies to include some of the more influential men in the community, particularly those who have both the financial resources and the political connections that might be necessary if this situation escalates into a serious confrontation." "Do you have specific individuals in mind?" "Tom Bradley, certainly, but also men like Judge Harrison, who retired here from the territorial court, and Major Campbell, who has extensive business connections throughout the territory. Both of them knew your father well and have expressed private concerns about the circumstances surrounding his death and the subsequent transfer of property." Sarah made mental notes about these potential allies, recognizing that building a broader base of support would be crucial if her legal challenge was going to succeed against someone with Margaret's apparent resources and determination. "I'll speak with them as soon as possible," Sarah promised. "In the meantime, should I be concerned about my personal safety or my position at the school?" Elizabeth considered this question carefully before answering, clearly unwilling to dismiss legitimate concerns while also not wanting to create unnecessary alarm. "I don't think Margaret would do anything that would obviously implicate her in wrongdoing, but I do think you should be careful about traveling alone, especially outside of town or during evening hours. As for your teaching position, the school board members are all solid supporters of your family, and I don't believe she could successfully undermine you there without providing clear evidence of professional misconduct." After Elizabeth departed, Sarah remained at the schoolhouse for another hour, revising her investigative timeline and considering the various ways that Margaret might respond to the knowledge that her stepdaughter was pursuing formal legal action. The conversation with Elizabeth had been sobering, forcing her to confront the reality that she was now engaged in what amounted to a strategic conflict with a woman who had already proven herself capable of sophisticated manipulation and careful long-term planning. The walk back to Martha's boarding house took Sarah through the heart of Cedar Creek's business district, and she found herself studying the various establishments with new awareness of the complex web of relationships and interests that connected the community's economic and social life. Margaret's success in running the ranch operation had undoubtedly created business relationships and financial dependencies that would influence how various individuals responded to challenges to her ownership of the property. At the boarding house, Martha greeted her with the kind of knowing look that suggested news of her legal consultation had already reached the informal information network that connected the town's various establishments. "I understand you had an interesting conversation with our local attorney this afternoon," Martha said without preamble, leading Sarah into her private sitting room where they could speak without being overheard by other residents. "Word travels quickly in a small community," Sarah observed, settling into one of Martha's comfortable chairs and accepting the cup of coffee that was offered. "It does indeed, and in this case, I think that's probably for the best. There are people in this town who have been waiting for someone to take formal action regarding the Martinez ranch situation, and your decision to work with J.T. Whitman has given them hope that justice might finally be served." Martha's words were encouraging, but Sarah could detect an underlying note of concern that suggested the situation was more complex than simple community support for her legal challenge. "I sense there's something you're not telling me directly," Sarah said, appreciating Martha's discretion while also needing to understand the full scope of the challenges she might be facing. "Margaret Martinez is not without her own supporters in this community," Martha replied carefully. "Her management of the ranch has created jobs and business opportunities that didn't exist before, and there are people who believe that challenging her ownership would be detrimental to the area's economic prosperity." This was exactly the kind of complication that Sarah had feared, the possibility that Margaret's genuine success as a ranch manager might have created vested interests in maintaining the status quo regardless of how she had originally acquired the property. "How significant do you think that opposition might become?" "Significant enough to matter, particularly if the legal proceedings become prolonged or expensive. There are also some people who believe that a young, unmarried woman shouldn't be running a large ranch operation, and that Mrs. Martinez represents a more stable and practical solution to property management." Sarah felt a flash of anger at this attitude, recognizing the kind of gender-based assumptions that had plagued her throughout her career as an independent working woman. The suggestion that her gender disqualified her from managing property that had been built by 3 generations of her family was both insulting and deeply frustrating. "I suppose those people haven't considered that I've been successfully managing my own affairs for years, including teaching positions that required considerable responsibility and judgment," Sarah said, working to keep her voice level despite her irritation. "No, they haven't," Martha agreed, "and I think they're wrong to dismiss your capabilities. But the reality is that you'll need to be prepared to demonstrate your competence and determination in ways that men wouldn't be required to prove themselves." The conversation with Martha continued for another hour, covering various aspects of community dynamics and potential strategies for building support while avoiding unnecessary confrontation with Margaret's allies. By the time Sarah retired to her room, she had a much clearer understanding of both the opportunities and the obstacles that lay ahead in her quest to reclaim her family's ranch. As she prepared for bed, Sarah found herself thinking about her father and the kind of advice he might have offered if he were still alive to guide her through this complex situation. James Martinez had been a patient man, someone who understood that worthwhile goals often required years of sustained effort and careful planning. He had also been someone who believed deeply in the importance of community relationships and the power of honest dealing to overcome even the most difficult challenges. Drawing on those memories and principles, Sarah began to formulate a more comprehensive strategy for the weeks and months ahead. She would continue her teaching responsibilities with the dedication and professionalism that had already earned her the respect of students and parents. She would work closely with J.T. Whitman to pursue the legal investigation and gather evidence of wrongdoing in the property transfer. Most importantly, she would build and maintain the network of community support that would be essential if her challenge to Margaret's ownership was going to succeed. The task ahead would be difficult and potentially dangerous, but Sarah felt strengthened by the knowledge that she was fighting not just for personal justice but for principles that resonated throughout the frontier community where she had been born and raised. Truth, fairness, respect for family legacy, and protection of the vulnerable against exploitation. These were values that transcended individual disputes and connected her struggle to larger questions of how civilized people should treat one another. As sleep finally claimed her, Sarah's last conscious thought was a quiet prayer for wisdom and strength in the challenges ahead, along with gratitude for the allies who were already beginning to rally around her cause. Tomorrow would bring new developments and new decisions, but tonight she felt more confident than she had since returning to Cedar Creek that justice was achievable and that her father's legacy could still be preserved for future generations of the Martinez family. The first sign of Margaret's retaliation came on a gray November morning, delivered in the form of an official-looking envelope that arrived at the schoolhouse just as Sarah was preparing for the day's lessons. The Territorial Postal Service had brought it from Denver, marked with the imposing letterhead of Blackwood, Sterling and Associates, the law firm that had handled her father's estate proceedings 3 years earlier. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she broke the wax seal, understanding that this communication represented Margaret's opening move in what was now openly acknowledged as a legal battle for control of the Double Bar Ranch. The letter was brief but devastating in its implications. Mrs. Margaret Martinez, through her legal representatives, was formally requesting a complete audit of Sarah Elena Martinez's personal finances, teaching credentials, and moral character, based on serious concerns regarding her mental stability and fitness to interact with impressionable children. The document went on to suggest that Sarah's obsessive and increasingly erratic behavior regarding settled family matters indicated possible psychological disturbance that warranted professional evaluation and potential removal from her position as Cedar Creek schoolteacher. Sarah read the letter 3 times before its full meaning crystallized in her mind. Margaret was not merely defending herself against legal challenge. She was launching a preemptive attack designed to destroy Sarah's credibility, professional standing, and financial resources before the property dispute could gain serious momentum. The strategy was both brilliant and ruthless, exploiting the social prejudices and professional vulnerabilities that made unmarried women in frontier communities particularly susceptible to character assassination and economic retaliation. The sound of children's voices in the schoolyard reminded Sarah that she had immediate responsibilities that could not be postponed while she processed this latest development. With considerable effort, she composed herself and prepared to face her students with the same calm professionalism that had earned their respect and affection over the past month. Whatever Margaret's accusations might claim about her mental state, Sarah was determined to demonstrate through her actions that she remained completely competent and dedicated to her educational duties. The morning lessons proceeded normally, with the younger children working on reading comprehension, while the older students tackled mathematical problems that would prepare them for the kind of practical calculations they would need in their adult lives. Sarah found that focusing on her students' needs provided a welcome respite from anxiety about the legal attack, reminding her that she was contributing something genuinely valuable to the community regardless of the outcome of her property dispute. During the lunch recess, however, her carefully maintained composure was tested by the arrival of George Henderson, whose usually cheerful demeanor had been replaced by obvious concern and barely controlled anger. "Sarah, I need to speak with you privately," Henderson said, his voice carrying the kind of urgency that suggested serious problems requiring immediate attention. "There are developments that you need to know about, things that affect both your teaching position and your legal situation." They walked together to the small office area behind the main classroom, where Henderson pulled out a chair and sat down with the weary movements of a man who had been dealing with difficult problems for several hours already. "I received a visit this morning from representatives of the Territorial Education Board," Henderson began without preamble. "They've been contacted by someone claiming that our current teacher is mentally unstable and potentially dangerous to students. They're demanding a formal investigation into your qualifications and behavior." Sarah felt her stomach clench at this confirmation that Margaret's strategy was already producing concrete results. The Territorial Education Board had the authority to suspend or revoke teaching certificates, effectively ending careers and making it impossible for dismissed educators to find work elsewhere in the frontier territories. "What kind of investigation are they proposing?" Sarah asked, working to keep her voice steady despite the fear that was building in her chest. They want to interview students, parents, and community members about your classroom management, your relationships with families, and any signs of what they call erratic or obsessive behavior that might indicate mental disturbance. They also want to review your personal finances and living arrangements to determine whether you're maintaining the kind of moral standards expected of teachers. The scope of the proposed investigation was clearly designed to be as invasive and humiliating as possible, creating exactly the kind of public scrutiny that would make it difficult for Sarah to continue living and working in Cedar Creek regardless of the ultimate findings. Do they have grounds for this kind of investigation, or can it be challenged? Henderson's expression grew even grimmer as he considered her question. Technically, any citizen can file a complaint about teacher conduct, and the Education Board is required to investigate serious allegations. However, I've been on this school board for 12 years, and I've never seen an investigation launched based on such vague accusations from anonymous sources. Sarah understood immediately that this was confirmation of what she had suspected. Margaret had used her connections and resources to orchestrate an official attack that would be very difficult to defend against, particularly since Sarah would be required to prove her mental stability and professional competence rather than simply denying the charges. What can we do to protect my position? The school board is meeting in emergency session this evening to discuss our response, Henderson replied. We have the authority to resist the territorial investigation if we can demonstrate that it's frivolous or motivated by personal animosity rather than legitimate concerns about student welfare. However, we'll need substantial community support and clear evidence that you're being targeted for reasons unrelated to your teaching performance. This news provided a glimmer of hope, suggesting that Sarah's allies in the community were prepared to fight for her professional survival even as she pursued her legal challenge to Margaret's ownership of the ranch. Is there anything I can do to help prepare for the board meeting? Actually, yes. We need documentation of your teaching effectiveness and your positive relationships with students and families. Letters from parents, examples of student progress, evidence of community involvement. Anything that demonstrates your competence and character. Henderson paused, clearly considering how much additional information to share about the political dynamics surrounding the investigation. I should also tell you that several prominent families have already contacted me to express their support for your continued employment. The Crenshaws, the Bradleys, the Morrisons, and at least 6 others have made it clear that they view this investigation as a malicious attack on an excellent teacher. Sarah felt a surge of gratitude toward these families who were willing to risk their own social and business relationships to defend her against Margaret's accusations. Their support would be crucial not only for maintaining her teaching position, but also for demonstrating community backing that might influence the legal proceedings related to the ranch. After Henderson departed, Sarah spent the remainder of the lunch period considering her options and trying to develop a strategy that would allow her to defend herself against multiple simultaneous attacks. The afternoon teaching session would need to proceed normally, demonstrating her continued competence and dedication, but she would also need to begin gathering the kind of documentation that might protect her professional position. The afternoon lessons went smoothly, with her students responding to instruction with their usual enthusiasm and respect. Sarah made careful note of particularly successful learning moments and positive interactions that could be cited as evidence of her teaching effectiveness, understanding that every aspect of her professional behavior was now subject to scrutiny and potential misinterpretation. After dismissing the children for the day, Sarah walked directly to J.T. Whitman's law office, where she hoped to discuss the legal implications of Margaret's counterattack and to coordinate her defense strategy across both the professional and property disputes. Whitman was waiting for her with his own collection of disturbing news, having spent the morning researching the legal tactics that Margaret's attorneys were employing and the potential consequences for Sarah's position in both matters. "I've reviewed the documents that were served on you this morning," Whitman said, gesturing toward copies of Margaret's legal filings that were spread across his desk. "This is a sophisticated and well-coordinated attack designed to undermine your credibility before we can present our evidence about the property transfer." Sarah settled into the chair across from his desk, noting the serious expression that had replaced his usual professional optimism. "What are our options for responding?" "We have several possible approaches, but each carries significant risks and costs. We can file a counter-motion challenging the basis for their investigation and demanding disclosure of the evidence supporting their accusations. We can also begin our own formal legal proceedings regarding the ranch property, using the attention generated by their attack to bring publicity to the legitimacy of your claims." Whitman paused to consult notes he had made during his research, clearly weighing the strategic implications of various response options. "However, I need to warn you that escalating this conflict will require substantial financial resources and will probably result in a very public and potentially damaging legal battle. Margaret's attorneys are from one of Denver's most expensive law firms, and they appear to have unlimited resources for pursuing this matter." The mention of unlimited resources hit Sarah like cold water, forcing her to confront the practical reality that she was engaged in a legal battle against someone with access to professional expertise and financial backing that she could not hope to match through her own efforts. Is there any way to level the playing field, or at least ensure that the case is decided on its merits rather than on who can afford better lawyers? "There might be," Whitman replied thoughtfully. "I've been in contact with some colleagues who specialize in property fraud cases, and there's some interest in your situation as a test case for territorial law regarding exploitation of elderly or mentally impaired property owners. If we can demonstrate clear evidence of fraud, it might be possible to interest the territorial prosecutor in pursuing criminal charges, which would shift the burden of legal costs to the government." This possibility offered a ray of hope, suggesting that Sarah's case might be viewed as having broader legal significance beyond her personal dispute with Margaret. What would be required to convince the prosecutor to take action? Clear documentary evidence that Mrs. Martinez knew about the mineral deposits before her marriage to your father, combined with proof that she deliberately concealed that information during the legal proceedings that transferred the property. We would also need medical testimony supporting the community observations about your father's mental decline during his final months. Whitman pulled out a detailed timeline he had been developing, marking key dates and potential sources of evidence that would need to be gathered and verified. "I've made some preliminary inquiries about earlier geological surveys in the area, and I've identified several potential sources of information that predate Mrs. Martinez's arrival in Cedar Creek. There was apparently a railroad survey conducted in 1883 that included geological assessments, and there are records of mining claims filed in the area during the late 1870s. Sarah felt her excitement building at this news, recognizing that such documentation might provide the proof of advance knowledge that would be crucial for establishing fraudulent intent. How quickly could we obtain access to those records? "I can travel to Denver next week to examine the territorial archives, and I've arranged to meet with the railroad company's land development office to review their survey results. If we can find evidence that the mineral potential was documented before 1884, it would significantly strengthen our position." The conversation continued for another hour, covering various aspects of legal strategy and the coordination between Sarah's defense against the teaching investigation and her challenge to Margaret's ownership of the ranch. By the time she left Whitman's office, Sarah had a much clearer understanding of both the challenges ahead and the potential pathways to success. The school board meeting that evening was held in the back room of Henderson's General Store, with all 5 board members present along with a dozen community members who had come to show their support for Sarah's continued employment. The atmosphere was serious but supportive, with Tom Bradley serving as an unofficial spokesman for the families who opposed the territorial investigation. "This whole business is nothing but a malicious attack on a fine teacher who's done excellent work with our children," Bradley declared, his weathered face showing the kind of controlled anger that indicated deep personal investment in the outcome. "Sarah Elena has been teaching here for barely 2 months, and already we can see improvements in student engagement and educational progress." Elizabeth Crenshaw rose to add her own testimony, presenting a letter signed by 15 ranch families who wanted their support for Sarah's continued employment entered into the official record of the meeting. "Mrs. Martinez has clearly been an exceptional teacher who has brought both professional competence and genuine caring to our school," Elizabeth said, reading from the letter. "The accusations against her mental stability and professional fitness appear to be motivated by personal animosity rather than legitimate concerns about student welfare." One by one, other parents and community members spoke in Sarah's defense, creating a strong record of support that would be difficult for the territorial investigators to dismiss or ignore. Sarah herself was invited to address the board, and she spoke briefly but effectively about her commitment to educational excellence and her gratitude for the community's confidence in her abilities. When the formal presentations were complete, the school board retired to private session to develop their official response to the territorial investigation. After 40 minutes of deliberation, Henderson emerged to announce their unanimous decision to resist the investigation and to request that the Territorial Education Board provide specific evidence supporting the accusations before any formal proceedings could begin. "We have complete confidence in Miss Martinez's professional competence and personal character," Henderson declared, reading from the board's written resolution. "We believe that the accusations against her are unfounded and motivated by considerations unrelated to her teaching performance or student welfare." The announcement was greeted with applause from the assembled community members, but Sarah understood that this was merely the first skirmish in what would likely be a prolonged battle for her professional survival. After the meeting, Tom Bradley approached her with additional information that had emerged during his own investigation of recent events in the valley. "I've been talking to some of the older ranchers about activities on the Double Bar property over the past few years," Bradley said, his voice lowered to avoid being overheard by casual listeners. "There have been some interesting developments that might be relevant to your legal situation." They walked together toward Martha's boarding house, using the privacy of the darkened street to discuss sensitive matters that could affect Sarah's case against Margaret. "What kind of developments?" "Survey crews working in the northern sections of the ranch, equipment being brought in that doesn't seem related to cattle operations, and some unusual traffic between the ranch and various business offices in Denver. Nothing obviously improper, but patterns that suggest Mrs. Martinez has been planning something more complex than simple ranching operations." This information aligned perfectly with Sarah's suspicions about Margaret's knowledge of mineral deposits and her long-term plans for exploiting the property's hidden value. "Have any of these activities been documented or witnessed by people who might be willing to testify about what they observed?" "Several people have seen the survey crews and unusual equipment, and a few have kept notes about dates and activities because they were curious about what was happening. If you need formal testimony, I think we could arrange for credible witnesses to support your case." Bradley paused at the front gate of the boarding house, clearly weighing whether to share additional information that might be even more significant. "There's something else you should know," he said finally. "I've been told that Mrs. Martinez has been in contact with mining interests from back east, companies that specialize in extracting valuable minerals from ranch properties. The conversations have been kept very quiet, but there are people in the banking community who are aware of the discussions." Sarah felt her pulse quicken at this revelation, understanding that it provided potential evidence of Margaret's plans to exploit the property's mineral wealth while maintaining the pretense of operating a simple cattle ranch. "Do you know any details about these mining companies or their specific interests in the property?" "Not yet, but I'm working on getting more information. The key point is that if we can document these contacts and prove that they began before Mrs. Martinez gained full control of the property, it would support your argument that she married your father primarily to access valuable mineral resources." After parting with Bradley, Sarah climbed the steps to Martha's boarding house with her mind racing through the implications of everything she had learned during this eventful day. Margaret's attack on her teaching position was clearly designed to distract from the property dispute while undermining her credibility as a witness to her father's mental decline. The strategy was sophisticated and well-funded, but it was also creating opportunities for Sarah and her allies to demonstrate community support and gather additional evidence of wrongdoing. Martha was waiting in the front parlor with a pot of coffee and the kind of sympathetic expression that suggested she had been following the day's developments through the informal communication networks that connected all aspects of small-town life. "I heard about the school board meeting," Martha said, pouring coffee for both of them and settling into her favorite chair. "It sounds like the community is rallying behind you in a way that will be difficult for your opponents to overcome." "I'm grateful for the support," Sarah replied, "but I'm also concerned about the financial and personal costs this battle is going to impose on people who are trying to help me. Margaret clearly has resources that I can't match, and she's willing to use them ruthlessly to protect her position." Martha nodded thoughtfully, clearly considering the broader implications of the conflict that was developing around Sarah's challenge to the property transfer. That may be true, but you have something that money can't buy: the respect and affection of people who knew your family and understand the difference between right and wrong. In a small community like this, that kind of moral authority can be more powerful than expensive lawyers and intimidation tactics. The conversation with Martha continued for another hour, covering various aspects of community dynamics and the ways that public opinion could influence both legal proceedings and practical outcomes in frontier societies. By the time Sarah retired to her room, she felt somewhat more optimistic about her chances of success despite the escalating nature of Margaret's attacks. As she prepared for bed, Sarah found herself thinking about the courage and integrity of the people who had chosen to support her cause despite the potential costs to their own interests. Tom Bradley, George Henderson, Elizabeth Crenshaw, and the other families who had spoken on her behalf were risking their own social and business relationships to defend principles of justice and community loyalty that transcended personal considerations. Their willingness to take such risks reinforced Sarah's determination to continue fighting for her father's legacy regardless of the obstacles Margaret might place in her path. The battle was becoming more expensive and more public than she had originally anticipated, but it was also revealing the strength of character and commitment to justice that existed within the Cedar Creek community. The challenges ahead would be formidable, requiring her to defend both her professional reputation and her legal claims against well-funded opposition that was clearly prepared to use any available means to maintain control of the Double Bar Ranch. But Sarah felt strengthened by the knowledge that she was not fighting alone, and that her cause had attracted the support of people whose judgment and character she trusted completely. Tomorrow would bring new developments in both the teaching investigation and the property dispute, but tonight Sarah felt more confident than ever that truth and justice would ultimately prevail over deception and manipulation. The fight for her father's legacy was entering its most critical phase, but she was prepared to meet whatever challenges Margaret might devise with the quiet strength and stubborn determination that had always been the hallmarks of the Martinez family character. The December snow fell silently on Cedar Creek as Sarah Elena Martinez walked through the pre-dawn darkness toward what would prove to be the most important day of her life. In her leather satchel, alongside her teaching materials, she carried a manila envelope containing documents that J.T. Whitman had obtained during his investigations in Denver, evidence so compelling that the territorial prosecutor had agreed to meet with them that very morning to discuss formal charges of fraud and elderly exploitation against Margaret Martinez. 3 weeks had passed since the school board's resounding defense of Sarah's teaching position, 3 weeks during which Margaret's expensive lawyers had been forced to withdraw their investigation request in the face of overwhelming community opposition and complete lack of substantiating evidence. But those same 3 weeks had also seen Whitman's methodical research bear fruit in ways that exceeded Sarah's most optimistic expectations, uncovering a pattern of deliberate deception that stretched back years before Margaret's first appearance in Cedar Creek. The territorial prosecutor, Daniel Morrison, had arrived in town the previous evening and was staying at Martha's boarding house, a coincidence that had allowed Sarah to observe him during dinner and form an initial impression of the man who would decide whether her case merited official action. Morrison was perhaps 45 years old, with a kind of sharp intelligence and quiet authority that marked successful frontier lawyers who had chosen public service over private wealth. His questions during their informal conversation had been precise and probing, suggesting both skepticism about ambitious claims and genuine interest in pursuing justice when supported by solid evidence. At the schoolhouse, Sarah spent the early morning hours preparing detailed lesson plans that would allow a substitute teacher to maintain educational continuity if the day's legal proceedings required her extended absence from the classroom. She had learned to plan for such contingencies during the weeks of escalating conflict, understanding that Margaret's attacks could disrupt her teaching schedule at any moment. The children deserved consistent, quality education regardless of the adult disputes that swirled around their community, and Sarah was determined to protect their learning even as she fought to reclaim her family's legacy. The sound of horses approaching through the snow brought Sarah to the schoolhouse window, where she watched J.T. Whitman arrive accompanied by 2 men she didn't recognize, presumably officials from the territorial capital who would participate in the morning's proceedings. The sight filled her with nervous anticipation, understanding that the next few hours would likely determine whether months of investigation and community support would translate into meaningful legal action against Margaret's fraudulent acquisition of the Double Bar Ranch. At 9 o'clock sharp, Sarah walked into Whitman's law office to find it transformed into an impromptu courtroom, with chairs arranged around his desk and official stenographic equipment set up to record testimony and evidence. Prosecutor Morrison sat behind the desk with the authoritative manner of someone accustomed to evaluating complex legal cases, while his two associates prepared documents and organized the evidence that Whitman had compiled over the past months. "Miss Martinez," Morrison said, rising courteously as she entered. "Thank you for making yourself available this morning. I've reviewed the preliminary evidence that Mr. Whitman has provided, and I have some questions that will help me determine whether this matter warrants formal prosecution." Sarah took the seat indicated and composed herself for what she understood would be a thorough and potentially challenging examination of her accusations against Margaret. The stakes could not be higher. A successful prosecution would not only restore her family's ranch, but would also establish important legal precedents for protecting elderly property owners against sophisticated fraud schemes. "Before we begin," Morrison continued, "I want you to understand that criminal fraud charges require proof beyond reasonable doubt, a much higher standard than civil litigation. Everything you tell me today must be completely accurate and verifiable, because any inconsistencies or exaggerations could undermine the entire case." "I understand completely," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. "Everything I've told Mr. Whitman is true to the best of my knowledge, and I'm prepared to testify under oath about any aspect of my father's situation or Margaret's conduct." Morrison nodded approvingly, then opened the manila folder that contained Whitman's investigative findings and began the methodical examination that would determine whether Sarah's months of struggle had been justified. "Let's begin with the geological survey evidence that Mr. Whitman discovered in the territorial archives. I understand there were surveys conducted on your father's property as early as 1882, well before Mrs. Martinez appeared in this area." Whitman stepped forward to present a collection of official documents, maps, and technical reports that represented the most damning evidence against Margaret's claims of innocent intentions. "These are the original railroad survey reports from 1882 and 1883, Whitman explained, spreading the documents across Morrison's desk. "They clearly identify significant limestone deposits and probable copper veins in the northern sections of what is now known as the Double Bar Ranch. The reports recommend further exploration for potential mining development." Morrison examined the documents carefully, paying particular attention to the technical descriptions and commercial assessments that established the property's hidden value years before Margaret's marriage to James Martinez. "This is substantial evidence of mineral potential," Morrison agreed. "However, we need to prove that Mrs. Martinez had access to this information before her marriage. Do we have any documentation of her obtaining or reviewing these surveys?" "We have something better," Whitman replied, producing another set of documents that Sarah had not previously seen. "These are records from the Denver mining office showing that a woman named Margaret Blackwood, using her maiden name, filed inquiries about mineral rights and survey reports for the Cedar Creek Valley in March of 1884, 2 months before she appeared at the church social where she met James Martinez." Sarah felt her heart skip at this revelation, understanding that it provided direct proof of Margaret's advanced planning and deliberate targeting of her father based on knowledge of the property's mineral wealth. Morrison's expression became notably more interested as he examined these records, clearly recognizing their legal significance for establishing premeditated fraud. "This is exactly the kind of evidence we need," Morrison said. "It demonstrates advanced knowledge, specific targeting of the property, and deliberate concealment of material facts during the marriage negotiations. Combined with testimony about Mr. Martinez's mental decline, it could support charges of fraud and elderly exploitation." The prosecutor turned to Sarah with the kind of direct attention that indicated crucial testimony. "Now I need you to tell me, in your own words, about the changes you observed in your father during his final months and about any evidence you have regarding his mental capacity during the period when legal documents were signed." Sarah drew upon months of careful preparation and community testimony to provide a comprehensive account of her father's deterioration, the suspicious circumstances surrounding legal proceedings, and the pattern of manipulation that had isolated him from longtime friends and advisers. She spoke for nearly an hour, answering Morrison's detailed questions about dates, witnesses, and specific incidents that demonstrated James Martinez's diminished capacity during the critical period. "The community witnesses I've interviewed all tell the same story," Sarah concluded. "My father was not himself during those final months, and Margaret deliberately prevented people who might have questioned her influence from having meaningful contact with him." Morrison made extensive notes during her testimony, occasionally asking for clarification or additional details that would strengthen the potential prosecution case. "Mr. Whitman has also provided me with financial records suggesting that Mrs. Martinez's claimed investment in saving the ranch may have been exaggerated or misrepresented. Can you tell me about your father's actual financial situation during that period?" Sarah related her conversations with banker Patterson and the evidence suggesting that while James Martinez had experienced some financial pressure, the crisis was not as severe as Margaret had claimed, and the rescue funds were not as substantial or as urgently needed as she had represented. When Sarah's testimony was complete, Morrison called for Tom Bradley, who had been waiting outside to provide his own account of James Martinez's condition and the suspicious activities he had observed around the ranch during Margaret's tenure. Bradley's testimony was particularly powerful because of his long friendship with Sarah's father and his reputation for honest dealing throughout the community. He described specific incidents of confusion and forgetfulness that he had witnessed, Margaret's efforts to control access to her husband, and the various survey crews and unusual equipment that had appeared on the property in recent years. "James Martinez was one of the sharpest men I ever knew when it came to ranch business," Bradley stated firmly. "The decisions he made during those final months were completely out of character, and they came at exactly the time when his judgment seemed most affected by whatever illness was taking hold of him." Elizabeth Crenshaw followed with her own testimony about the community's concerns and their unsuccessful attempts to intervene on James Martinez's behalf, painting a picture of systematic isolation and manipulation that supported the fraud allegations. After nearly 4 hours of testimony and evidence review, Morrison called for a recess while he consulted privately with his associates about the legal merits of the case. Sarah, Whitman, and the community witnesses gathered in the general store next door, where George Henderson provided coffee and moral support while they waited for the prosecutor's decision. "I think we presented a strong case," Whitman said quietly, though Sarah could detect underlying uncertainty about the outcome. "The documentary evidence is compelling, and the witness testimony creates a clear pattern of exploitation. But prosecution decisions involve political and practical considerations beyond just the legal merits." Sarah understood his concern. Pursuing criminal charges against Margaret would require substantial resources and would create precedents that might affect other property disputes throughout the territory. Morrison would need to balance the strength of their evidence against broader considerations about legal policy and resource allocation. When they were called back to Whitman's office, Morrison's expression was serious but determined, suggesting that he had reached a significant decision. "Based on the evidence presented today," Morrison announced, "I believe there are sufficient grounds to pursue criminal charges against Mrs. Margaret Martinez for fraud and exploitation of an elderly person in connection with the property transfer of the Double Bar Ranch." Sarah felt a wave of relief and vindication wash over her, understanding that this decision represented not just personal justice but vindication of her father's memory and protection of his legacy. "However," Morrison continued, "I want to be clear about what happens next and what will be required from all of you as this case proceeds through the legal system." The prosecutor outlined the formal charges that would be filed, the evidence that would need to be presented at trial, and the testimony that would be required from Sarah and the community witnesses. He also explained that Margaret would have the opportunity to present her own defense and that the case would ultimately be decided by a territorial jury that might not share the community's knowledge of local personalities and relationships. "This will be a complex and potentially lengthy legal proceeding," Morrison warned. "Mrs. Martinez has access to expensive legal representation, and they will challenge every aspect of our case. You should all be prepared for a vigorous defense that may include attacks on your credibility and motives." Sarah accepted this warning with the quiet determination that had sustained her through months of investigation and conflict. "We understand the challenges, but we also believe that the truth needs to be revealed and justice needs to be served. My father deserves to have his legacy protected from those who would exploit his memory for personal gain." Morrison nodded approvingly at her response. "I'll be filing the formal charges tomorrow morning, and I expect that Mrs. Martinez will be arrested within the next few days. In the meantime, I need all of you to continue documenting any additional evidence that might become available and to avoid any direct contact with the defendant that might compromise the case." After the legal officials departed for their return journey to Denver, Sarah and her supporters gathered at Martha's boarding house to discuss the implications of the day's developments and to plan for the challenges that lay ahead. The atmosphere was cautiously celebratory, tempered by understanding that formal charges were only the beginning of what would likely be a difficult and uncertain legal process. "I want to thank all of you for everything you've done to help me reach this point," Sarah said, looking around the room at the friends and neighbors who had risked their own interests to support her cause. "Whatever happens during the trial, I'm grateful to be part of a community that values truth and justice enough to stand up for what's right." Tom Bradley raised his coffee cup in an informal toast. "To James Martinez, who raised a daughter worthy of his memory, and to the hope that justice will be served for good people who deserve better than they've received." The sentiment was echoed around the room, creating a moment of shared purpose and determination that strengthened everyone's resolve for the battles ahead. 3 days later, the news that everyone had been anticipating arrived via telegraph from Denver. Margaret Martinez had been arrested on charges of criminal fraud and elderly exploitation, and her expensive lawyers were already preparing what promised to be an aggressive defense strategy. The arrest had taken place at the Double Bar Ranch, where Margaret had been supervising the installation of mining equipment that would now serve as additional evidence of her long-term plans to exploit the property's mineral resources. Sarah received the news while teaching her afternoon lessons, and she had to exercise considerable self-control to avoid displaying the satisfaction and relief she felt at this vindication of months of struggle and investigation. Her students deserved her full attention and professional composure, regardless of the dramatic developments affecting her personal situation. After dismissing the children for the day, Sarah walked through the snow-covered town toward the boarding house, noting the various expressions of support and congratulation she received from community members who had followed her struggle with interest and sympathy. The arrest had clearly been the topic of extensive discussion throughout Cedar Creek, and public opinion seemed strongly supportive of the prosecution's decision to pursue criminal charges. At the boarding house, Martha greeted her with a kind of warm smile that indicated both personal satisfaction and professional appreciation for the drama that was unfolding around her establishment. "I understand that justice may finally be served in the Martinez Ranch matter," Martha said, leading Sarah into her private sitting room where they could discuss developments without being overheard by other residents. "It's a step in the right direction," Sarah replied carefully, understanding that the legal process was far from complete and that Margaret's arrest was only the beginning of what would likely be a complex trial. "But I know that her lawyers will fight the charges vigorously, and there's no guarantee about the ultimate outcome." Martha nodded thoughtfully. "That may be true, but the fact that the territorial prosecutor was willing to file criminal charges sends a powerful message about the strength of your evidence and the seriousness of the alleged crimes. It also means that the burden of proof shifts to Mrs. Martinez to explain her conduct rather than to you to prove wrongdoing." This observation provided considerable comfort to Sarah, who had been carrying the weight of investigation and accusation for months while Margaret maintained her position of apparent respectability and legal legitimacy. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of J.T. Whitman, whose expression combined professional satisfaction with obvious concern about the challenges that lay ahead. "I've received word from Morrison's office about the arrest and the initial legal proceedings," Whitman reported. "Margaret's lawyers have already filed several motions challenging the charges and demanding detailed disclosure of our evidence. They're also requesting an expedited trial schedule, probably hoping to resolve the matter before we can gather additional supporting evidence." Sarah understood that this aggressive legal strategy was designed to pressure the prosecution into a quick resolution while limiting their ability to present the most comprehensive case possible. How should we respond to their demands for expedited proceedings? Morrison is pushing for adequate time to prepare, but the territorial courts are already backlogged with cases, and there's pressure to resolve matters quickly to avoid tying up judicial resources. We'll probably be looking at a trial date sometime in early spring, which gives us perhaps 3 months to complete our preparation. Whitman spread out a timeline showing the various tasks that would need to be completed before trial, including additional witness interviews, expert testimony about geological surveys and property values, and detailed financial analysis of the transactions surrounding James Martinez's estate. The good news is that Margaret's arrest has encouraged several additional witnesses to come forward with information about suspicious activities they observed over the past few years. Some of these people were reluctant to speak up before, but the formal charges have given them confidence that their testimony might actually lead to meaningful consequences. This development was particularly encouraging to Sarah, who had always suspected that more people in the community had observed irregularities but had been hesitant to become involved in what appeared to be a private family dispute. What kind of additional information are these witnesses providing? Details about survey crews and mining consultations that establish a pattern of activity extending back several years, financial discussions between Margaret and outside investors that occurred before your father's death, and observations about your father's condition and Margaret's control over his daily activities. All of it supports our case that this was a long-term scheme rather than opportunistic behavior. The meeting continued for another hour, covering various aspects of trial preparation and the coordination of evidence and witnesses that would be required to present the strongest possible case. By the time Whitman departed, Sarah had a clear understanding of both the opportunities and the challenges that lay ahead in the legal battle for her father's legacy. As winter deepened over Cedar Creek, Sarah maintained her teaching responsibilities while participating in the intensive preparation required for what everyone expected to be a highly publicized and closely watched trial. The case had attracted attention throughout the territory, both because of its legal precedent value and because of the dramatic story of a young woman fighting to reclaim her family's inheritance from a manipulative stepmother. The months of preparation revealed additional evidence that strengthened the prosecution's case, including testimony from Denver business associates who had met with Margaret about mining development plans months before James Martinez's death, and medical records that supported community observations about his mental decline during the period when crucial legal documents were signed. When the trial finally convened in the territorial courthouse in Denver, Sarah found herself facing Margaret Martinez across a courtroom packed with spectators, journalists, and legal observers who had come to witness what promised to be one of the most significant property fraud cases in territorial history. Margaret, elegantly dressed and flanked by her expensive legal team, maintained the composed demeanor that had served her well during her years of deception. But Sarah could see something different in her stepmother's eyes, a wariness and calculation that suggested she understood the serious nature of the charges and the strength of the evidence arrayed against her. The trial lasted 6 days, with the prosecution presenting a methodical and compelling case that traced Margaret's scheme from her initial research into mineral rights through her calculated pursuit of James Martinez and her systematic exploitation of his declining mental capacity. Witness after witness testified to the pattern of manipulation and deception that had culminated in the fraudulent transfer of ranch property worth far more than anyone had realized at the time. Margaret's defense attorneys fought vigorously, challenging witness credibility, questioning the medical evidence about James Martinez's mental capacity, and arguing that their client had acted in good faith based on legitimate romantic feelings and genuine concern for an elderly man's welfare. But their arguments were undermined by the documentary evidence of advance planning and the consistent testimony of community members who had observed Margaret's calculated behavior over several years. On the final day of trial, Sarah was called to provide closing testimony about her father's character, his love for the ranch, and his intentions for preserving the family legacy. As she stood in the witness box, looking out at the packed courtroom that included friends and neighbors from Cedar Creek as well as legal officials and journalists from across the territory, Sarah felt the weight of representing not just her own interests but the principles of justice and protection for vulnerable elderly citizens. "My father spent 40 years building that ranch," Sarah said, her voice carrying clearly through the silent courtroom. "He dreamed of passing it on to future generations of our family, and he trusted the woman he married to respect those dreams and protect his legacy. Instead, she exploited his declining health and his loneliness to steal everything he had worked for, based on secret knowledge of mineral wealth that she had deliberately concealed from him and from our community." The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning with guilty verdicts on all charges. Margaret Martinez was sentenced to 5 years in territorial prison and ordered to pay full restitution, including the return of the Double Bar Ranch to Sarah Elena Martinez, along with compensation for the mineral resources that had been extracted during her illegal ownership. As Sarah walked out of the courthouse into the spring sunshine of Denver, surrounded by the friends and neighbors who had supported her through months of struggle and investigation, she felt a deep sense of completion and gratitude that extended far beyond personal vindication. Justice had been served, her father's legacy had been protected, and important legal precedents had been established for protecting elderly property owners against sophisticated fraud schemes. The journey back to Cedar Creek took on the character of a triumphant procession, with stops in various towns where news of the verdict had preceded them and where people wanted to congratulate Sarah on her persistence and courage in pursuing justice despite overwhelming obstacles. When they finally arrived home, Sarah found the Double Bar Ranch exactly as she remembered it from her childhood, rolling hills and productive pastures that represented 3 generations of Martinez family dedication and love. Standing in the same spot where she had confronted Margaret months earlier, Sarah felt the presence of her father's spirit and the satisfaction of knowing that his life's work would continue in the hands of someone who truly understood its value and meaning. The ranch would require years of careful management to reach its full potential, but Sarah felt prepared for that challenge, strengthened by the support of a community that had proven its commitment to justice and blessed with a legal ownership that would allow her to build on her family's foundation while protecting their legacy for future generations. As the sun set over the mountains that surrounded the valley where her great-grandfather had first homesteaded, Sarah Elena Martinez stood on her own land, surrounded by friends who had become family, secure in the knowledge that truth and justice had triumphed over deception and greed. The fight for her father's legacy was finally over, and the work of honoring his memory could truly begin.